The airport was busy as Admiral James Carter walked through the main entrance, pulling his small travel bag behind him. People hurried past him, some talking on their phones, others checking their tickets, all in a rush to get to their destinations. James was in no hurry. He had traveled many times before, both for duty and personal trips. Today was supposed to be a peaceful flight. No meetings, no reports, just a comfortable journey back home. James was a man of discipline and honor. He had served in the Navy for decades, rising through the ranks with hard work, intelligence, and dedication. His achievements had earned him the title of Admiral, a position only a few could reach. Yet today, he wasn't in uniform. He preferred to travel in simple clothes, a plain blue polo shirt, and a pair of comfortable jeans. He didn't need attention. He didn't need special treatment. He just wanted to enjoy his flight. As he approached the check-in counter, he pulled out his first-class ticket and handed it to the airline agent. The young woman at the counter gave him a polite smile, quickly typing on her computer. After a few seconds, she nodded and handed his ticket back. "Everything looks good, Mr. Carter. Enjoy your flight," she said. He thanked her and moved toward the security checkpoint. The line wasn't too long, and James patiently waited for his turn. As he stood there, he noticed a few people glancing his way, their eyes flickering with curiosity. He was used to it. As a tall, well-built man with a confident posture, he often stood out, even when he wasn't trying to. But he ignored the stares and focused on getting through security quickly. After passing through the checkpoint, he made his way to the boarding gate. He had booked a first-class seat to enjoy a little comfort. After all, with all the time he had spent serving his country, he deserved to travel without stress. The boarding area was filled with passengers waiting for their turn to board. Some sat in chairs, scrolling through their phones, while others stood near the gate, ready to get in line. James found a quiet corner and waited for the airline staff to start the boarding process. That's when he heard a loud voice nearby. "I think you're in the wrong place," a woman's sharp voice said. James turned his head slightly and saw a middle-aged woman staring at him. She was dressed in expensive clothes, holding a designer handbag, and had a look of suspicion on her face. He didn't know her, but it was clear that she had already decided something about him. James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He had experienced situations like this before. Some people judged others too quickly. He had learned that patience was always the best response. The airline staff finally announced the first-class boarding. James picked up his ticket and stepped forward, but he had a feeling that this flight was about to become more eventful than he expected. James stepped forward, holding his ticket firmly. As he walked toward the first-class boarding lane, the same woman from earlier suddenly moved in front of him, blocking his path. She narrowed her eyes and crossed her arms, standing tall as if she were in charge of who could board the flight. "Excuse me," she said, tilting her head slightly. "This is the first-class line." James remained calm. He had faced far more difficult situations in his life. A simple misunderstanding at an airport was nothing compared to the challenges he had overcome in the Navy. He gave her a polite nod and lifted his ticket slightly so she could see it. "Yes, Mom." "I know," he replied, keeping his voice even and respectful. The woman, however, didn't move. She let out a short laugh, looking around as if expecting others to agree with her. Some nearby passengers turned their heads, sensing tension in the air. "Are you sure?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I've been flying first class for years, and I think you're in the wrong place." James took a deep breath. He could see where this was going. He had encountered people like her before, people who judged others based on appearance rather than facts. He wasn't wearing a business suit or flashy jewelry. He didn't look like what she expected from a first-class passenger. Before James could respond, the gate agent stepped forward, looking between the two of them. The young man at the counter seemed unsure of what to do. "Sir," the agent said hesitantly, "can I see your ticket again?" James was slightly taken aback. He had already shown his ticket once during check-in. Why was he being asked again? But instead of arguing, he handed the ticket over with a calm smile. The woman smirked, clearly feeling victorious. She shifted her weight and sighed loudly. "I knew it," she said under her breath. "People always try to sneak into first class. I see it all the time." James heard her words but chose not to react. He wasn't going to let her behavior ruin his mood. The gate agent glanced at the ticket, scanning it carefully. After a few seconds, his face changed. He realized the mistake. "Oh, my apologies, Mr. Carter," the agent said quickly, handing back the ticket. "You're all set for first class." The woman's face twitched in surprise. She blinked a few times, clearly not expecting that response. "What?" she blurted out. "Are you sure?" The agent gave her a small professional smile. "Yes, Mom. He's a first-class passenger." James nodded, took his ticket, and stepped forward without another word. But he knew this wasn't over yet. The woman still stood there, fuming, and he had a strong feeling that this flight was going to be more interesting than he had planned. James walked past the woman and handed his ticket to the flight attendant standing at the jet bridge. The attendant greeted him with a warm smile and gestured for him to proceed. He nodded in return, stepping onto the plane. The soft lighting and quiet atmosphere of first class were a welcome change from the busy airport. He found his seat, placed his bag in the overhead compartment, and sat down comfortably. He let out a small breath, hoping that the rest of the flight would be peaceful. But just as he settled in, he heard a familiar voice from behind. "I don't believe this," the woman muttered as she entered first class. She was clearly still upset. James glanced to the side but remained silent. He had no interest in arguing. He simply wanted to enjoy his flight. But the woman wasn't done yet. She leaned slightly toward the flight attendant, whispering something while throwing glances in James's direction. Though he couldn't hear every word, he caught a few phrases. "Mistake. Must have upgraded him. Are you sure?" The flight attendant gave her a polite but firm response. "Ma'am, all passengers here have first-class tickets." The woman's face tightened. She huffed but walked to her seat a few rows behind James. Even though she had stopped talking, her frustration was obvious. James could feel her eyes on him from time to time, but he ignored it. He pulled out a book from his bag, planning to read until takeoff. A few minutes later, another flight attendant came by, offering drinks to the first-class passengers. James accepted a glass of water, thanking her politely. He could see the woman watching again, her expression unreadable. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, she spoke up. "This is unbelievable," she said loudly, looking around for support. Some passengers turned their heads, curious. First class used to have a certain standard. James slowly put down his book. He had been patient. He had ignored her comments, but this was getting out of hand. Before he could say anything, the flight attendant, the same one who had given him water, responded in a professional tone. "Ma'am, if there's a problem, please let us know. Otherwise, we'd appreciate it if you remained seated and allowed everyone to enjoy the flight." The woman's mouth opened slightly as if she wasn't expecting to be challenged. She scoffed but said nothing more. James gave the flight attendant a small nod of appreciation. He had faced all kinds of challenges in his career, but unnecessary drama on a flight was something he preferred to avoid. The pilot's voice then came over the speaker, announcing that they would be taking off shortly. James took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat. He hoped this would be the last of the trouble, but deep down, he had a feeling the woman wasn't done yet. This flight was going to be a long one. The plane began to taxi toward the runway. James took a deep breath and looked out of the window, watching the airport lights blur past. The quiet hum of the engines was soothing, and for a moment, he allowed himself to relax. He had traveled thousands of miles during his career, but he still enjoyed the peaceful moments before takeoff. But that peace didn't last long. The woman behind him sighed loudly. Then she shifted in her seat. Then she sighed again, louder this time. It was clear that she wanted attention. Some passengers looked her way, but no one said anything. They were all waiting to see what she would do next. James kept his focus on his book, pretending not to hear, but the woman wasn't going to let it go. "I don't understand," she muttered, though her voice was loud enough for people nearby to hear. "I paid so much for this ticket, and now it feels like just anyone can sit in first class." James's fingers tightened around the pages of his book, but he stayed calm. He had dealt with more stressful situations in his career. A rude passenger wasn't going to ruin his day. A flight attendant walked by, checking that everyone was buckled in. The woman quickly waved her over. "Yes, Mom," the flight attendant asked with a professional smile. "I just have a question," the woman said, tilting her head. "Are you sure there wasn't a mistake? I mean, I thought first class was supposed to be exclusive." She glanced at James for a split second before looking back at the flight attendant. The flight attendant didn't hesitate. "Ma'am, every passenger in this section has a valid first-class ticket." The woman's smile was tight. "I see. Well, I just wanted to be sure. You know, standards are important." James closed his book. He could feel his patience wearing thin. He had given her enough chances to mind her own business, but she kept pushing. Still, he chose to remain silent. He knew the best way to deal with people like her was to let them talk themselves into a corner. The flight attendant, sensing the tension, nodded politely and walked away. James hoped that would be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. The woman leaned forward slightly, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "You must have used points or something," she said. "That's the only way you could afford this seat, right?" James finally turned his head, looking directly at her for the first time. He didn't smile, but he also didn't frown. His expression was unreadable. He had dealt with all kinds of people throughout his career, but there was always something interesting about watching someone dig their own hole. Instead of responding, he simply raised an eyebrow and returned to his book. The woman, expecting an argument, seemed surprised by his silence. She shifted in her seat again, suddenly uncomfortable. And just then, a voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard." James smiled slightly. He knew this flight was about to get very interesting. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign turned off with a soft ding. Passengers around James stretched, some adjusting their seats, while the flight attendants moved around to offer drinks and snacks. It was a smooth flight so far, at least in terms of turbulence. James took a sip of water and tried to focus on his book again. But he knew that behind him, the woman was still fuming. He could feel it. Every few minutes, she would shift in her seat, sigh loudly, or mumble under her breath. It was obvious that she wasn't used to being ignored. A flight attendant walked by again, this time offering warm towels to the first-class passengers. James accepted his with a polite nod, but as the flight attendant moved toward the woman, she suddenly reached out and tapped the attendant's arm. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice filled with frustration. The flight attendant stopped, keeping her professional smile. "Yes, Mom. How can I help you?" The woman sighed dramatically, then pointed toward James. "I just have a question. Does the airline not have any dress code for first class?" James heard her words, but he didn't react. Instead, he turned a page in his book, pretending to be deeply focused on reading. The flight attendant blinked in confusion. "A dress code, Ma'am." "Yes," the woman said, nodding quickly. I'm just saying. I thought first class was for professionals, business travelers, people who actually belong here." She paused, then added, "It just doesn't seem fair when some of us paid full price." The flight attendant's smile didn't fade, but her tone became firmer. "Ma'am, we do not have a strict dress code for first class. All that matters is that passengers have a valid ticket." The woman's mouth tightened. "So, anyone can just walk in and sit here." James finally closed his book. Slowly, he turned his head to look at her. "Ma'am," he said in a calm, steady voice, Are you saying you don't think I belong here?" The woman looked startled for a moment. She opened her mouth as if to speak but then hesitated. Clearly, she hadn't expected him to address her directly. "Well," she muttered, "I didn't say that exactly." James nodded slowly. "I see. Then what exactly are you trying to say?" A few passengers nearby had started listening. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances. The tension in the air was thick. The woman let out a nervous laugh. I was just curious. That's all." James held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small smile. Curiosity is good, but assumptions can sometimes lead to embarrassing moments. The woman's face turned slightly red. She quickly looked away, pretending to check something on her phone. James leaned back in his seat, satisfied. The flight wasn't over yet, but he had a feeling the best part was still to come. The flight continued smoothly, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional clinking of glasses and the soft murmurs of conversation. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, serving meals to the first-class passengers. The smell of freshly cooked food filled the air, adding to the comfort of the flight. James accepted his tray with a polite nod, unfolding his napkin neatly. He was looking forward to enjoying a quiet meal. But of course, the woman behind him still had something to say. She sighed loudly, making sure everyone around her could hear. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. James didn't react. He had already made his point earlier, and he had no reason to continue the conversation. But the woman, unable to let go of the situation, leaned forward again. "So," she said, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention, "what do you do?" James took a slow sip of his water before answering. "Excuse me." The woman gave a tight smile. "I mean, what kind of job do you have? I'm just curious." James set his glass down carefully. He had met many people like her before, people who made judgments without knowing the full story. He could have responded with sarcasm or ignored her altogether, but instead, he decided to keep things simple. "I work in the Navy," he said. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh." She paused for a moment, then tilted her head, "Like a regular officer or something." James smiled slightly. "Something like that." The woman's curiosity grew. She must have assumed he was just a low-ranking officer or someone who had recently joined. She nodded slowly, as if trying to piece together a story in her mind. "Well, that makes sense," she said. "I guess they must give discounts to veterans or something." A few passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably. They could sense where this conversation was heading. James, however, remained perfectly calm. He had learned long ago that patience was often the best way to deal with people like her. "Maybe," he said, keeping his voice neutral. The woman leaned back in her seat, seemingly satisfied with her assumption. "That's nice," she said, waving her hand as if she had solved a mystery. "I mean, it's good that airlines support people who served." James didn't correct her. He knew the truth would come out soon enough. Just then, a flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Mr. Carter, would you like anything else?" James shook his head politely. "I'm fine, thank you." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. Something about the way the flight attendant addressed him made her pause. It was as if she suddenly realized there was more to his story than she had assumed. James could see the wheels turning in her mind. He smiled to himself. The best part was yet to come. The plane continued its smooth journey through the sky. Some passengers had settled into their seats, watching movies or taking naps, while others quietly enjoyed their meals. James remained calm, his focus still on his book, but he could feel the woman behind him growing restless. She had assumed she had figured everything out, that he was just some low-ranking Navy officer who had received a discount on his first-class ticket. But something about the way the flight attendant had addressed him earlier seemed to bother her. James knew she wasn't done yet. After a few minutes, she spoke again. "So," she said, trying to sound casual, "how long were you in the Navy?" James turned a page in his book before responding. "A long time." The woman waited for more, But when he didn't say anything else, she pressed further. "And you're still in service?" James nodded. "Yes." She tapped her fingers on the armrest. It was clear that she wanted more details, but James wasn't giving them easily. He had no reason to explain himself to her, but the more he stayed quiet, the more impatient she became. "Well, that's nice," she said, forcing a smile. "It's good to see hardworking people rewarded." James glanced at her briefly, then returned to his book. He could see she was trying to convince herself that she had been right about him all along. But then, something unexpected happened. A flight attendant walked toward James with a bright smile. "Mr. Carter," she said respectfully, "the captain would like to personally welcome you aboard. If you'd like, he would be happy to meet you after the flight." James gave a small nod. "That would be great. Thank you." The woman behind him froze. Her eyes widened slightly as she looked between James and the flight attendant. Other passengers also turned their heads, curious about why the captain wanted to personally welcome him. The flight attendant, unaware of the woman's earlier behavior, continued with a polite smile. "The captain mentioned that he had the honor of meeting you before, sir. He was thrilled when he saw your name on the passenger list." James nodded again, still calm. "He's a good man. I'd be happy to catch up with him." The woman behind him blinked rapidly. Her confidence from earlier had completely vanished. You know the captain?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. James finally turned to look at her. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He simply met her eyes with the same steady expression he had kept throughout the flight. "Yes," he said, "we've worked together before." The woman's face turned pale. James could tell she was starting to realize her mistake. And the best part, the final moment was still to come. The woman sat stiffly in her seat, her expression filled with confusion and uncertainty. She had spent the entire flight making assumptions about James, convinced that he didn't belong in first class. But now, after hearing the flight attendant mention the captain's respect for him, she wasn't so sure anymore. James, however, remained calm. He had seen this kind of reaction before. He wasn't the type to boast or seek revenge, but he also wasn't going to let her disrespect go unnoticed. The plane continued cruising through the sky, and soon the captain's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're making good time, and we expect to land as scheduled. I'd also like to take a moment to extend a special welcome to an esteemed guest on board, Admiral James Carter. It is an honor to have you with us, sir." The cabin fell into a brief silence. A few passengers exchanged glances, some looking toward James with newfound respect. The woman behind him, however, gasped softly. "Admiral," she whispered under her breath. James finally turned around, meeting her wide-eyed gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "Admiral." Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She had spent the entire flight assuming he didn't belong, treating him as if he were beneath her. And now she realized she had been speaking down to a highly respected military leader. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice quieter than it had been the entire flight. James nodded. "You didn't ask." She swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean any offense," she added quickly. James gave her a small, polite smile. "I'm sure you didn't." For the rest of the flight, the woman remained silent. She no longer sighed dramatically, no longer made passive comments, and no longer tried to question James's presence in first class. She simply sat there, lost in her thoughts. When the plane finally landed, passengers began gathering their belongings. As James stood up to grab his bag, the woman hesitated before speaking again. I just wanted to say, thank you for your service," she said awkwardly. James met her gaze for a moment before giving a small nod. "Take care, Mom." With that, he walked toward the front of the plane, where the captain was waiting to greet him. As he shook hands with the captain, James couldn't help but smile to himself. Some lessons in life didn't need to be spoken out loud. They just needed to be experienced. And this was one lesson the woman would never forget. This final part wraps up the story with a strong message while keeping